Welcome to the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Larry Casper. Our topic today is a shortage of housing in Pennsylvania. You can join our discussion by calling us at 1-877-PA6-5001, or you can text us at 717-219-4001. But first, we're joined by Anthony Hennen from the Center Square. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Larry.
You filed a story about potential revenue for the state from so-called skill games. As far as lawmakers are concerned, just what is a skill game?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question here. Skill games are a new, I suppose, category of a gaming machine, of gambling. They sort of appear like a slot machine that you'll see in a casino, but these are scattered across bars and taverns in Pennsylvania, gas stations and convenience stores, VFW posts, and they're called games of skill games, because you can influence the outcome by how you hit the button, et cetera, et cetera. It's basically a new form of gambling that we've seen rise up in the Commonwealth in recent years.
Well, Anthony, let's get into the point of your story, which is about Governor Shapiro's projection for tax revenue. At least this is the first consideration versus the estimate from the Independent Fiscal Office. So what does Governor Shapiro expect to get tax-wise from skill games?
Yeah, so the Shapiro administration is hoping for a fairly big windfall from all of these if we bring them into a more formal regulated market. Shapiro is estimating that in the first year that we would do this, within his budget, he projects this would start as soon as July 1st. Then the next fiscal year, they would expect about $150 million to come in, and then that would rise steadily. Looking at, I believe a few years out, it'd be somewhere around 300 million or more. The Independent Fiscal Office is not exactly as optimistic, but still, it looks like it'd be significantly. The IFO analysis, looking at Shapiro's budget proposal, assuming a 42% tax rate and about $30,000 per machine across the Commonwealth, they would expect about $103 million in new tax revenue just from the next fiscal year. By the time this gets fully implemented and ramped up around fiscal year 2028, the IFO would expect about $420 million annually coming into state tax coffers.
So, Anthony, that means the IFO's projection is about $47 million less than the governor's projection, at least initially. And usually with state budgets, of course, we're talking billions of dollars. Just how significant or substantial a difference is that? Yeah,
it's interesting because I think when you're looking overall at the Shapiro budget and when you're reading the IFO reports projecting, deficits, surpluses, it's not all that significant, simply because it looks like we're spending more revenue by the state than we will actually have coming in, which I think is very clear why we're seeing such push for things like skill game legalization, recreational marijuana use legalization, et cetera, et cetera. As we have an aging population across the state, I think we're going to see more and more state and local governments really push to try to find, tax revenue wherever they can pull in. And, if we get more than 400 million annually coming in, that's not insignificant. It's not going to absolutely fill every budget hole, but, it's clearly big money here.
Now, Anthony, it would be convenient if we could make a nice apples-to-apples comparison here between the IFO and the governor's projections, but I understand that they have different start dates. And why would that be? Certainly, again, that makes it harder to compare which estimate might have more merit.
Yeah, I think you can sort of boil this down to the political processes here. Even looking at Shapiro's recreational marijuana legalization proposal, that also seems to have an early start date. We've seen this discussion about skill games go on for years now. We have a bill floating around in the Senate, authored by Gene Yaw, really trying to push for this legalization. It just seems like, these things take time to get through. It takes time to formalize this process, to get this set. And I think that's a big question. The other big question here is it's really hard to get a nice solid estimate on how many machines we have and how much revenue could actually come in from this. when you look at some of these projections, the IFO has had a devil of a time estimating just how many machines we would have across Pennsylvania. I mean, you look at the company that manufactures these Pennsylvania skill games. It's Pace-O-Matic, based in Williamsport. They estimate they have about 18,000 of these statewide already. But when we're talking about illegal gaming machines that other companies push out, it could be as high as 70,000 or even more. So it's very hard to compare just exactly how many we have in Pennsylvania, and it's hard looking at other states and their experiences with this.
How does the casino establishment view skill games in Pennsylvania?
Well, there's an interesting hearing, I believe, last fall, where casino representatives came in and testified in front of the state legislature. They called these machines an existential threat. We have seen a lot of opposition from the casino industry, partially because casinos' slot machines are taxed at 54%, but these skill games are taxed at 42%, or this proposal would be 42%. So they're worried about parity. They also argue it's undercutting their industry. This is something we've seen as the state has legalized more forms of gambling over the past 2 decades now. When they first worked out the agreement expanding into casinos, aside from just having it at horse racing tracks, part of that deal was horse racing would be supported by some of this revenue coming in. So the casinos are essentially arguing, this is undercutting us. This is unfair. The tax rates we have are already higher and support different state programs, state initiatives. So there is no blood loss between these two groups, and you see a lot of a big push from casinos to make sure these things do not become, do not at least undercut them. It seems like they've kind of given up on keeping them banned outright, but they're at least looking for parity and trying to make sure they're not, as rivalrous as a lot of other things.
Thank you, Anthony Hennen from the Center Square. More of the PCN Capitol Preview after a short break. Welcome back. Our guests are both chairman of the Housing and Community Development Committee. Representative Rich Irvin is the minority chair, and Representative Mike Sturla is the majority chair. How big a problem is finding affordable housing in Pennsylvania?
Well, it's pretty bad. We've done estimates. We don't have exact statistics, but to the best we can gather at this point in time, we're about 235,000 housing units short in Pennsylvania of what we need to accommodate everybody and to make sure that people can move into the state, as well as people within the state can move and find affordable housing.
Representative Irvin, what's your perspective on this problem?
Yeah, I think even the realtors, PA realtors, have actually put out a number of 98,000 housing units, and it's about, it's a high number. And I really do believe your younger generation, even to find an affordable apartment is next to impossible for them. My stepdaughter just had a child. She actually is living at home with my wife and I. And we've looked at different apartments throughout the rural central Pennsylvania that we're from in Huntington County and the surrounding counties. And rent prices are just almost double what they were probably 5 years ago. So I think that young startup families, single individuals with single income, I think they're having a real issue of finding an apartment and then actually being able to save to put a down payment on a home or something of that nature. I think the national average, I've been told, is you're supposed to be spending roughly 30% of your income on housing. And, that is really pushing up. And I think that's a real issue and a problem that it's in Pennsylvania and nationwide.
Yeah, and I will point out that the part of the way, or the best way, I believe, to drive the cost of housing down is to have a slight oversupply. When you have a shortage of housing, the market just naturally says, okay, whoever can pay me the most gets that unit, because there's more competition for the unit than there is supply. When that supply slightly over meets the demand, the the costs start to come down. So when people say, well, gosh, housing's so high, what are we going to do? We should do rent control. Or, I mean, I don't think that's the way around it. That doesn't do anything in terms of the supply. It just puts more stress on the amount that's not controlled. And so really what it is it is a supply issue. And we started seeing this happen prior to COVID, back after the 2008 recession. There was a slowing of the new housing starts nationwide. And then COVID, of course, put a stop to everything. And so we are literally 5 to 7 years behind where we need in terms of new starts of housing, whether it's individual houses, whether it's apartments, whether it's any sort of housing that people need to live, and in all ranges, all the way from what people traditionally think of as subsidized housing, which is mostly federal subsidies, to houses that are $200,000, $300,000, $400,000. Affordable, in my mind, is always as Rich said, the 30% of your income. So, if you're making $100,000, you may have a different price point than somebody that's making $50,000 or $30,000. But the reality is, what is affordable for you? And I always like to call it workforce housing, because there's very little housing anymore that is to subsidize for people that aren't working. And those persons, whether they have a disability or for whatever their reason is for not having work, that's a tiny portion of the housing market. The majority of the housing market is workforce housing. People that are working from jobs that are making minimum wage to people that are working that are making a couple $100,000 a year.
Now, a minute ago, you said part of the solution is to have an oversupply of houses. But how do you achieve that? That sounds like a real luxury in today's economy.
I think, a lot of this issue is driven sometimes by the interest rates. And as Chairman Sturla said, even with the COVID supply chain problem that we had, it was a young family trying to build a home. Next thing you know, they were getting a quote or a bid on a housing project or their house, and the contractor would say, individual would ask the contractor, well, how long is this bid good for? It's good for 3 days. If you want
not long at all.
That's because the price of your lumber was going skyrocketing, and the building materials were going through the roof, and that was a big issue, I think, especially during the COVID time frame, as what Mike said concerning, that has exacerbated the problem of lack of housing during the COVID years. Interest rates are really skyrocketing right now. Now, some realtors I've talked to have actually said, well, no, they're just leveling off back to where they should be. But I think, adding an additional, $500 to $1,000 onto a mortgage payment with interest rates going up is a federal problem that I really don't know if we can solve right here at the state level whenever it comes down to that.
Well, and I always look at, just to put things into perspective, the first house I bought, I think the interest rate on my mortgage was something like 13%. So I look at this and go, it's not so bad, but it's higher than what we had become accustomed to in the 3 to 5% range. And so I think things will start to normalize. But when you ask about, how do we get to the housing, I look at it and say we need to be tackling this at all levels. So on our committee, we're going to start looking at some, pre-manufactured housing and what some people think of as mobile homes, but in some cases doesn't even have any wheels on it. It's pre-manufactured. Right. It's less expensive. That helps you get past a bubble of need for housing. There's also, anything from small starter homes to larger homes. One of the things we found is that a lot of people are living in a 4-bedroom house that they don't need anymore, but they can't find a smaller house to downsize to, so they're not giving up their 4-bedroom house. And so the family that's living in the smaller house, you almost need to have like a swap program in some cases. There's just not enough inventory on the market, as the realtors always point out. They like inventory on the market. That's what's good. Right. That's what shows that there's a healthy housing market, and that isn't there right now.
The supply is down, but the cost is up.
Yeah.
And then you have, and I was just talking with Mike earlier before we came in, there's many on the conservative side of this issue that really feel that government needs to have a hands-off role on it. And the fact that let the market correct itself over time. rebuttal would be, as what Chairman Sturla said, what do we do whenever people don't have a home or they can't purchase a house and they're living in the streets or, couch surfing and things of that nature. So that's where is the line that you need to draw on that?
Yeah, I don't think we should be stepping in and necessarily, becoming the housing gurus of the state. But I think there are things that we can do to help expedite that market or to help enhance that market or help move that motivate that market to produce more housing.
We have a phone call for our committee chairman here this morning, and we're talking about the shortage of housing here in Pennsylvania. Robert from Clearfield, you are on PCN.
Okay, very good. Gentlemen, I'd like to have your thoughts on something. The demographics of Pennsylvania from a housing perspective is so varied. Now, you might have a housing shortage where you live. Up here, we don't have a shortage of housing. We have a shortage of buyers. It's often said in Clearfield, houses are not sold, they're disposed of, just at absolutely rock-bottom prices. And here in Clearfield County, so we have around over 300 abandoned homes. So you'd have to consider from a policy perspective, hey, not everywhere in this Commonwealth do you have a shortage of houses. You just have a shortage of buyers.
Yeah, well, and the thing I'll say is in areas where there is an oversupply of housing, as you pointed out, it obviously drives the cost of housing down. There, you need jobs. You need businesses to move in. And part of that is you got to have transportation. You got to have all those other things involved. You got to have sites that are ready to go. And there are economic development programs dealing with some of those things in Pennsylvania. That said, that's a different issue than the areas that literally have businesses. I've talked to my local chamber and the state chamber, and they say there are parts of Pennsylvania where companies have hundreds of jobs to fill, and they can't get people to fill them because when people try and accept that job, they can't find housing within an hour of where they were going to accept that job. And so they say, I'm not going to give up an hour's commute to and from work every day to take a job that doesn't pay me any more than I'm making where I already live. So they can't fill those jobs, and that part of it has become a real issue in terms of growth in Pennsylvania, and in particular, bringing in new Pennsylvanians. I mean, one of the things we want to do in Pennsylvania is to grow our population instead of have it decrease. If you want to do that, people need to move here, and if they can't find a place to live, if they can find a place to live, say in Clearfield, but have no job, that doesn't work either. So part of this is finding that mix, and that's where I think government can expedite or to help coordinate some things in ways that the free market maybe won't. It'll take a lot longer for the free market to sort of make those calculations. We can help force some of those calculations.
So access to jobs has a real impact on the value of real estate. That's what our caller's talking about.
Exactly. I think whenever I first entered the legislature, my biggest issue that I was looking to tackle is to make sure that we had family-sustaining jobs across Pennsylvania. And coming from rural Pennsylvania, actually Huntington County, the callers from Clearfield County, we're not too far away. I understand completely whenever it comes to having the jobs and the need for jobs. I think you have your young individuals that are coming out or that are looking to, college educated. They want to make sure that they can raise a family, and they don't have the access to that family-sustaining job in Clearfield County. So, as Chairman Sturla said, what can we do to help Clearfield County, help your remote county, especially in that north central part of the state, to attract those businesses there? A lot of times, I think you have your young family that they look at the cost of housing and they think, well, I'm never going to be able to afford a house, so I'm just not even going to try. And I'm not even going to pay my student loan because I don't care what my credit score is, because I'm never going to try to build my credit to buy a home or anything like that anyway. So that's a problem that is compounding on our younger generation, and we need to tell them about those houses in Clearfield County that are, maybe 40, 50,000 or a starter home, and then let them work their way up from there. So I appreciate the caller.
So let's talk some more about the impact of a labor shortage on a housing shortage. And as you fellas know, unemployment numbers are fairly low. I think the national rate I heard recently was less than 4%. Pennsylvania might be close to that. But unemployment numbers don't tell the whole story, do they?
Well, yes and no. They don't tell the whole story.
If you're not looking for a job, you're not included.
If you're not looking for a job, you're not included. And one of the things that we saw happen with COVID in particular, I think, was we saw a lot of women leaving the workforce in particular because they just said, you know what, the cost of daycare is so high that I'm only making, $30,000 a year, and I've got 2 kids, and the cost of daycare for 2 kids is $30,000 a year. Why don't I just stay home and
so it doesn't pay to work under those circumstances?
And that again, I mean, I think if we want to attract young families here, and I always use this example. My daughter and her husband and my 2 grandkids live in Washington D.C. My 3-year-old grandson just started K3, which is universal K3 in the District of Columbia, and their income as a result of one child being not being in daycare and being in paid for pre-K, their family income went up $24,000 last year. That's a big deal for a young family. That's being able to pay off student loans. That's being able to look at putting a down payment on a bigger house. That's being able to do those kinds. Now in Pennsylvania, the cost of daycare is not quite that high, but still, even if it's $15,000, the reality is you got 2 kids and that's a big deal. And so I think we need to start looking at ways to attract. We've done a lot to attract seniors here. We don't tax their income. We don't, and I love seniors. This is not a rap against seniors, but they're not the workforce. They're not the future workforce. If we want a future workforce, we've got to say, what is going to attract a young family that's raising that has young kids, and ways to make them happy and comfortable here, and to be able to start their life without being 3 steps in the hole. Mm-hmm. We got to start looking at some of those things.
Senior housing is in demand. And I know in my area, my district, in the Huntington and Franklin County area, there is a lot of senior housing that is being put up, and a lot of projects, and as soon as they're built, they're filled. We're getting a lot of retirees coming into the Huntington County, Franklin County area that they've maybe worked in D.C. all their life or in New York, and they thought this is a great place to retire. And as we said, Pennsylvania is very friendly to seniors whenever it comes to taxation. So that's what is being focused on, I think, by the investors. Another thing that we haven't talked about is how can we try to have these developers look at your workforce housing. Right now, I think the cost of building a new home could be up to anywhere of 23-24% of government regulations and permitting, and then delays in building because of the permits. So that's another thing I think we at the state can look at in trying to speed the process and reduce the cost of getting the workforce housing provided.
I was reading about this subject in Spotlight PA, and really dovetailing with what Representative Irvin was saying a minute ago, housing is often considered a local issue. And this is what Spotlight PA reported. They said, now is the time for action on the state level. So let's talk about your history. Representative Sturla, you've been in the legislature for a while. How much have you addressed this subject in the past, and how much is it changing now?
Well, it's interesting. When housing was doing fine by itself without, you go back pre-2008, before the housing boom, things were going gangbusters, and everybody was getting a low mortgage on a house that was bigger than they could afford and things like that. And then, the ship started to right itself a little bit. But I will also say, and this is just the little sort of kernel of things that affects the legislature. The Housing and Community Development Committee used to be called the Urban Affairs Committee. When it was called the Urban Affairs Committee, people thought it only meant that it was for cities. And so... Reasonable assumption. Nobody thought of it in terms of it having housing issues. And most of the housing issues that were dealt with was high-rise apartments in the urban areas and things like that, because that's what the members on that committee were interested in. As soon as we changed the name to the Housing and Economic Development Committee, you'd be surprised the number of people that went, hey, I'd like to be on that committee because I've got a housing issue in my district. And it goes from rural to suburban to urban. And that has sort of changed the flavor and the tone of, hey, we can actually pay attention to housing. And it is one of those issues that Republican, Democrat, rural, suburban, urban, affects everybody at this point in time.
Which, coming from one of the most rural districts in the state, having being a chairman of the Urban Affairs Committee doesn't really play well in my district. So.
The uncommittee for the rural area.
Right.
Let's talk about and Representative Irvin, I know you have something to say about this. This is based on what you said a couple minutes ago. Now, there's a package of legislation in your chamber, of course. As you fellows know, there's a whole bunch of bills being talked about. And the lawmakers who worked on these bills blame government regulation for the housing shortage. And you got into that just for a minute. You enumerated a bunch of things. Expand on that. Government regulation, how has it gone too far, is the implication.
Right, and I think there's going to be a fine line there of where the state can overstep where local government's at. I mean, I think, I've always been under the feeling that I think government should be at the most local level. And your township supervisors, us being a commonwealth dealing with, 2,500 municipalities across the state of Pennsylvania, where is that line that we as a state legislative body can say, okay, well, no, you cannot be over-regulating this issue of building and everything of that nature. So, where we are looking at maybe, realty transfer taxes as an issue that's come up in the committee that we've looked at, for first-time home buyers, or tax credits for first-time home buyers, tax credits for...
How about low-interest loans?
Low-interest loans.
How does the future look for low-interest loans? That just occurs to me as a possible solution.
Yeah, the thing there is it requires a lot of money. And as soon as you start talking, when you're talking about housing, I mentioned earlier that I thought it was 235,000 units short. Rich said he thought it was 98,000 short. But at 235,000 units short, on the average unit costing around $300,000 to build in the state of Pennsylvania, you're talking about $80 billion worth of housing. I mean, I was in the governor's office a couple months ago, and I said, Governor, this will be real quick. I only need $100 billion. And he said, okay, great, see you later, and like shut me out the door.
The whole state budget is $60 billion, right?
Yes, right. So when you talk about low interest loans, that's where we rely on the private market. Now, can we figure out a way to get the private market we'll guarantee some things for them so that they don't get caught in a housing bubble again? And as long as we're watching what they're doing and they're not just out there giving loans to people that can only afford a $100,000 mortgage and are giving them $400,000 mortgage, we might be able to stimulate some of that if we're guaranteeing some of those things. But I don't know that we're going to come up with the dollars for the loans themselves, because it's a big chunk of money.
Representative Rich Irvin and Representative Mike Sturla, thank you. We're going to give you a break just for a minute while we look at program notes for PCN. On Wednesday, On the Issues has Dave McCormick, a Republican running for U.S. Senate, at 7 p.m. After that, we'll have Richard Farr, Executive Director of the PA Transportation Association, at 7:30 p.m. Journalist Roundtable is on the road in Scranton this week. Boris Krochniak from WVIA, Scott Schaefer from WNEP-TV, and Dave Janowski from the Citizens Voice will be the guests on Thursday at 7 p.m. Indoor football comes to PCN. Watch the Harrisburg Stampede play against the Maryland Eagles, courtesy of the Sports Fan Base Network. That's on Sunday at 12 noon. The public affairs coverage you watch on PCN TV is now free on the internet. Go to PCNTV.com and check out our streaming service, PCN Select. PCN is a 501c3 nonprofit television network that receives no government funding. We rely on viewers and donors like you to help PCN continue to bring you everything Pennsylvania. To make a donation, visit PCNTV.com. All right, gentlemen, we're here talking about the housing shortage here in Pennsylvania. And a minute ago, I mentioned that there's a whole bunch of bills going on in the House right now. It's hard to talk about all of them. As far as you're concerned in the majority, Representative Sturla, what rises to the top for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think part of it is leveraging the capital that's necessary. And so, there might be, we're probably going to be looking at the ability to do some tax credits with employers. And I don't, not that I don't want company-owned houses like they're, the old, hey, yeah, you come
company
work for
housing,
me.
the company store.
Right, yeah, right, But if we say to a company, hey, you know what, we will give you some tax credits as long as you are contributing to some workforce housing that's, close to where the jobs are, we might be able to leverage some dollars there. We can work with the banks and figure out how to get some dollars leverage there. There's also, I don't want to impose upon local municipalities zoning regulations, but we can also give them some sample zoning and say, here's like overlay zoning you could do so that you don't have to go through that process locally to figure out how to increase housing. If we'll give you some overlay zoning, you can simply adopt this, and that shortens that process. As Rich pointed out, part of this is a time frame also. You say to a local municipality, change your zoning so that you can have more housing, and 2 years later they get their zoning ordinance changed, and it might not even be a decent one. If you give them an overlay zone, if you say, here, we've worked this out, this would work anywhere in the state, just plug your name in here, that's maybe a 2-month process instead of a 2-year process. And we're also trying to look at ways to say to developers, so where are there jobs or housing sites that we can start to get ready? We have jobs in our sites where we start to get industrial sites ready. Can we start doing the same thing for housing? Can we say, we're going to start getting you through that process early on, and the state will help with getting you through that process locally?
Well, let's take a step back in this discussion and just consider zoning laws in general, and how can they get in the way of home construction? Zoning 101, Representative Irvin, is what I'm asking.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm just going to give you an example, and I haven't even talked to Chairman Sturla about this, but an issue that's just come to my attention in my district is there's a little town called Mount Union, PA, borough. And back in the 78s, there was a brickyard there, 70s, and, actually early 1900s. The brickyard was the main income producer for the employer in Mount Union. And after the brickyard shut down in 70s, a lot of the houses became blighted. So a lot of them were torn down, so a lot of low-income housing was put in, and a lot of the lots have just been left sit vacant. So the problem is now you have a vacant lot, and with the new building codes that come in, the setbacks, they used to be built right on top of each other. The setbacks are so that you would have to build a 20-foot wide house, and no one wants to build a 20-foot wide house on one of these building lots. And you already have the public sewer, public water at these at the lots, vacant lots, but you can't build on them. So is there a way that legislatively, how do we need to address this? Or does the borough council themselves have the ability to try to overrule these? The way I'm looking at it, your building code, your municipality can only go more stringent. They can't go, less stringent than what the state building code is at this the point in time. So can we give the flexibility in urban, rural, suburban areas around Pennsylvania to allow them, if they're bringing housing, workforce housing, affordable housing to Pennsylvania, some waiver type of issue whenever it comes to the building code?
Yeah, and in some cases it might even be planning grants related to housing. So if you want to change your zoning related to housing, we'll give you a grant to help you do that. We're not going to give you a thing to do all your rezoning and all that kind of stuff. But basically, the as I view it, there is a crisis in housing, and so how do we get through this crisis in a way that we don't 20 years from now go, boy, it's sad we did that, but in a way that's smart about it, We know how we can do it. We've used, as you point out, you don't want a 20-foot wide house, but you don't want to just slap something up there that's like, okay, well, here we go, you know. So it's a lot of work, but it's something that I believe absolutely needs to be done.
Well, the Philadelphia Inquirer really puts a sharp point on this subject. They say zoning and building codes are strangling the supply of new homes.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, yes. And part of that is, as was pointed out, I mean, you have a municipality that probably adopted a sort of suburban type zoning code. I mean, we did this in the city of Lancaster years ago where they started having setbacks. Well, all the other buildings were out on the street, and now this one had to have a 10-foot setback. So it's like, well, that person's got a little yard out there in the middle of no man's land, and you know it's not like there's an adjoining yard.
Right.
And so now we've gone through the whole process of reversing that and saying you actually have to build to the property line, and so part of that is some of this is us getting in our own way, and sometimes, and how do we get back out of our own way in a lot of cases.
Now, sometimes you see on TV these so-called tiny homes. I wonder if that's something that legislators give much thought to as far as the future of housing is concerned.
We actually visited a tiny homes manufacturer.
What did you see? Tell me about the visit.
Well, I'll let you go first.
I was very impressed with the quality of construction of the tiny homes, and they have a trailer special built for the tiny homes, and it's actually three-wheeled trailer that can be mobile and moving it around. And then there was actually little tiny home parks that people can park in, but not that they're permanent. They could still get up and move if they'd want to.
Right.
And I think even I just was at an event last week in my district, and I had one of the mental health directors for the regional behavioral health coordinators. She told me, she said, "Hey, what about these tiny homes? These would be great for my clients." But I've also was very shocked with the quality. There is also a heftier price that comes along with those tiny homes. I think they're right around $100,000 for a tiny home. So
is that right? Now that's very intriguing.
Yeah.
I had no idea they could cost that much.
Yeah. But I think as when we looked at these, I was like, okay, we saw one where people had rented their lots. There's also, I have a person who's interested in trying to figure out how we can develop tiny home parks where the people actually own the lot that they're on. So it becomes like a condominium type of project. And then that person, if they decide to leave, they can either sell their tiny home with their lot, or they can pick up their tiny home and go and sell their lot to somebody else who wants to put a tiny home there. But right now, some of those things aren't permitted at the local level. And so part of what I think we want to do is when we talk about opening the mobile home law, is to look at what's the whole continuum there, from tiny homes to pre-manufactured homes that don't have any wheels but are all considered the same thing. I mean, the sort of weird part about the way we do things in Pennsylvania, a mobile home, as you think of a mobile home that gets taken out to a site and then put on a foundation somewhere, actually is titled with a trailer license, and it goes through the Department of Transportation. I get that it may need a trailer license to haul it from its point of manufacture to where it gets put on a foundation. But then at some point in time, I think you decommission the title and you call it a house. And it deals with what kind of lending you can get on it because of certain construction techniques. You can only get lending on certain things. There's only VA loans are approved for certain things, but not other things. So, I mean, the construction technique has to do with what kind of loans you can get on it. The kind of property you put it on has to do with whether or not you can get a mortgage on it or not. I mean, there's a whole host of issues that we want to delve into in terms of how do we make this because when you think of it, while a $100,000 home is expensive in one sense, the average cost of construction for a 2-unit apartment in the state of Pennsylvania is about $300,000. So not such a bad price for $100,000, you know.
You know, in my previous career, I was county treasurer and tax claim director, which is a collection of delinquent real estate taxes. And that problem that Chairman Sturla just mentioned, I dealt with on a daily basis, that you had an individual that was trying to get a hold of a title to a mobile home so that they could get a bank loan. And there's no way of even getting one, because you just can't call up the state. And many times they cut the tongue off of a mobile home, and that was where the VIN number for the mobile home was. And next thing you know, there's no way even tracing who the title was in 20 years ago.
Right.
So it becomes a real issue.
Like filing the number off of a firearm.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'd call it that.
Well, when you're missing critical information like that, and you want some kind of accountability, that's a setback. I can see.
It wasn't like you know, they weren't doing it malice. It was just get that tongue out of the way.
Just to get it out of the way. Right. That's a good way to look at it. We have just a few minutes left in our show, gentlemen. So let's consider what Governor Shapiro is proposing on the subject of housing here in Pennsylvania. He's proposing spending $80 million on the subject. Part of it will go to what he's calling a public legal defense fund against evictions, and just how urgent is the need for a fund like that?
Well, I think given the crisis we're in, it's important now. The hope would be that if you can get to the point where there's adequate amount of housing, the number of evictions, I believe, will go down dramatically, because the cost of housing will come down proportionally, and you will also have the ability for someone to, part of the reason that some people are getting evicted is because they understand that they're not paying their rent, but they can't find another place to go to. And so the alternative is, I'm going to stay here as long as I can until you evict me, because otherwise I'm on the street. And so I'm staying here till the last minute that they come and haul me out of this place. And, you know, the sad part is we have people that are working 40 hours a week that are living in their car right now in the state of Pennsylvania. And that is not a situation that is conducive to a good economy. It's not a situation that's conducive to anybody that's happening to. And if there is adequate housing provided, there's always going to be some place that they'll be able to find to rent at a cost that they can afford. And then I think you can avoid a whole lot of the evictions process at that point.
How about the home repair grant program we've been hearing about for several months, and how much can that ameliorate this whole situation?
Well, I think that's a very popular program, and I think U.S. Senator Fetterman actually is trying to expand that even into the nationwide.
Yep.
You know, I think one of my concerns is I think it's a great program to be able to assist people and you know, that can't afford to keep the upkeep in their home. But you know, I want to see the real impact to make sure that money is going where it is. That's why I introduced a resolution to have the Auditor General actually take a look at this program and give the legislature a report back to make sure that the money is being used appropriately and as needed. And back to you know, the one issue that we were talking about, making sure that we have the accountability in the governor's proposal. I think it's a case-by-case basis on what individuals and you know, emergency shelter grant money needs to be going out to individuals. Do we want to just be throwing money at that issue, or do we want to truly, you know, make sure it's a person in need, or is it someone that really just does need to get a job? Now, there are people out there that are actually working 40 hours a week and they can't afford a home. But, you know, I want to make sure that if an individual does qualify and they are, you know, able-bodied individual that can get out and get a job to be able to afford the rent, I don't want them just living off the government system in order to make sure that they're getting their housing paid for that way. So,
do you anticipate any opposition to any of the bills the House is working on at this point? I mean, local governments and landlords, they have associations too.
Yeah, we've had some opposition, but one of the things that we try and do in this committee, and we work across party lines on this, when a bill comes through our committee, we as Rich will tell you, both of us get together with our staffs. We try and get any stakeholder that has an interest in a bill to sit down with us and go through these bills and say, what's good about this? What's bad about it? How can we improve it? Where's the best, outcome on this?
That sounds like public hearings.
Well, we actually do that in private because we're just getting information on it. Once we get all that together, we then draw up an amendment that includes all of that. We sit down with everybody and say, okay, here's like the final product. Does it make sense? Do you have any problems with it? Are there any issues with it? And, there's still some people that aren't part of that process, whether it's individual legislators or a group that's, maybe a one-off group somewhere that wasn't involved. But we try and make sure anybody that wants to can get involved. And so there's always going to be some opposition to anything. But we try and make it a bipartisan bill that has the support of any known interest group. Part of that's the legislative process, working through how do we reach a compromise on this to get a good product. Are there individual legislators that have different ideas of what ought to happen and why it should happen and how and when and where? Sure. But we try and at least alleviate most of that up front rather than just forcing a bill through and having everybody throw stuff at it and see what sticks. Yeah,
I do commend Chairman Sturla on those work groups that we get together, and you have Republican input, Democratic input, you have stakeholders input, and it does make a better product whenever it comes out of the committee. Not saying that we're going to agree on every bill, and we don't, but the fact is that this does make a better product whenever it does come to the House floor and moving forward.
Last question, gentlemen. How can getting Pennsylvanians into more affordable housing help the economy overall? Try to take the long view.
I think we need to try to bring and keep our younger generation here in Pennsylvania. We're bleeding our educated youth, and they're leaving the state. And if we can, make sure that they have a family-sustaining job and affordable housing right here in Pennsylvania, it's only going to help with the tax base to make sure that the revenue is there to support the government programs that are out, whether it be through education, healthcare, senior services, anything that goes along with that. But whenever you have individuals, your youth working age leaving the state, that's doing nothing but drain the state.
Yeah, I think the governor in his budget address said that right now I think 1 in 4 Pennsylvanians is a senior citizen, and within 10 years it's supposed to be 1 in 3. Part of that is how do we make sure there's housing available for young people to stay here? And that I think is the biggest factor in terms of making sure there's a job for the people. So in places where there are housing, making sure there's a job, and in places where there's not housing, making sure there's housing so that they can take the job that is available. And so it's a balancing act, no question about it. But we know there's a need for it.
Our guests have been both Chairman of the Housing and Community Development Committee, Representative Rich Irvin, the Minority Chair, and Representative Mike Sturla, the Majority Chair. Thanks for joining us. PCN's Ellen Frantz talked to a group called the Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania about Governor Shapiro's budget proposal for the environment.
Welcome to our program. What aspects of Governor Shapiro's budget proposal stood out to you?
Well, we're just really pleased that Governor Shapiro has proposed a budget this year that advances key environmental and conservation priorities. And to me, there are really 3 elements that stood out to me. Additional funding for our critical departments of environmental protection and departments of conservation and natural resources. This is really important in making sure that we're holding industry accountable and keeping an eye on environmental protection. He's also included really critical programs like capping abandoned wells, and additionally is fighting for increased public transportation funding, which is very important for communities, particularly in southeastern Pennsylvania, that are facing a real fiscal cliff with SEPTA towards the end of this year.
You mentioned funding for public transportation and capping empty wells. How would that impact the environment?
That's a great question. Funding for public transportation is really critical because not only of environmental issues, but also general well-being of our communities. Public transportation takes and keeps cars off the road. It gives people an option on how they are getting themselves to work, to errands, how they are moving about in their day-to-day lives. It decreases emissions and helps make our communities thrive. Capping abandoned wells is absolutely critical. Pennsylvania is home to one of the largest amounts of abandoned wells in the country, and these wells emit climate change causing pollution. We absolutely need to be going in and drawing down on the newly available federal resources from President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law in order to cap these wells and eliminate these sources of pollution. They also can have not only devastating impacts on the air we breathe, but also our water sources, leaking acid mine drainage into things like our local streams and our water supplies.
What issues did the governor leave out of his budget proposal that you wish he had included?
Well, there's a couple of pieces of legislation that we're really hoping will be able to pass through the legislature during the always contentious and active period of budget negotiations. There's two programs in particular that we're really keeping an eye on. One is called Solar for Schools. This program is, we like to call a win-win-win. It would create grants using federal funds to give solar panels to schools, allowing them to save on their energy costs. It would save taxpayer dollars, and it would help save the environment while creating union, good-paying jobs for communities. We are really hopeful that we can get this legislation across the finish line in the Senate. It has already passed the State House. We're really hoping that we can push that through in this budget season. Additionally, we're looking at community solar legislation. This is another piece of legislation that will help leverage this federal funding that's available under President Biden's clean energy law and help make Pennsylvania a real leader in creating union jobs, growing clean energy industries, and providing options for their energy use for communities across the state.
Governor Shapiro proposed a $10.3 million agricultural funding program that would give farms access to better technology and equipment. Does the Pennsylvania agricultural industry take into consideration the environment when doing things like funding for technology and things?
I really appreciate that question because another thing that we're working on here at Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania down in Washington, D.C. is actually the next iteration of the federal Farm Bill. And the Farm Bill is really critical in incentivizing and empowering our farmers to not only continue to be the life engines of our communities, but to also play a really critical part in fighting climate change. So many, too many emissions that cause climate change come from the agricultural sector. And we know that farmers are interested in very popular and proven programs that help them reduce those emissions. However, over the years, those programs have had limited funding and have not been able to serve all the farmers that are interested in accessing them. We're advocating in this year's Farm Bill to draw down on some of those Inflation Reduction Act funds I was talking about earlier. There's over $20 billion available for climate-friendly agricultural practices. So to take things back to Pennsylvania, I think that Pennsylvania farmers play a critical role and can continue to play a critical role in fighting climate change and protecting our environment. In so many ways, farmers are the original stewards and conservationists of our land, but our government, through things like the federal Farm Bill and what Governor Shapiro is proposing, needs to help empower them to be able to play that role in the long term.
After seeing the appropriations hearings with the Departments of Environmental Protection and Conservation and Natural Resources, do you feel confident that the amount of funding that these pro-environmental causes will get is enough to sustain them?
There is always a need for more funding. Pennsylvania is a really big state. We have 67 counties, and we have about 10 years in our past of consistent defunding of these agencies. For so long, these agencies were not funded at the level they needed to be. And this was especially obvious during the fracking boom of the last 10, 15, 20 years or so. So we are still playing catch up in so many ways. We're really pleased with what Governor Shapiro has proposed. And also, we know that in order to truly in our communities, we need to continually invest in and grow both the DEP and the DCNR so that they can fully embody the roles they're intended to.
Molly Parzan, Executive Director of Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Here's a reminder about On the Issues this Wednesday. We'll have Dave McCormick, a Republican running for U.S. Senate, at 7 p.m. Then after that, we'll have Richard Farr, Executive Director of the PA Transportation Association, at 7:30 p.m. That's it for the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Larry Kasper. Thanks for watching.